Okay, so for this tutorial, we're going to go over how to produce kind of a sort of an exploded axon or an assembly animation of parts using our Farnsworth house model from the previous importing and exporting tutorial. Basically, what we're going to do is kind of utilize our ground plane here to hide all of the geometry for the house, and we're kind of going to do an animation of everything kind of popping through in different stages. So for example, you might have nothing shown on your plan here, and then maybe the let's see, let's grab structure first. Maybe the structure comes up first, and then you've got the floors come up next, and then maybe the stairs follow suit. We're going to kind of do a sequence animation of all these parts coming together, and that's going to kind of show you guys how to animate sort of a sequence of components sort of organizing themselves into a complete 3D model or set of relationships. Obviously, the way you animate this, your architectural piece kind of exploding or separating, coming back together, is all going to depend on the look and what it is you're actually trying to animate. So for a facade, for example, like a chunk of a facade, it might be like exploding or pulling apart and then coming back together again. But this is going to kind of show you just how to do that real quick. It's pretty straightforward. So I'm just going to kind of undo all of that, kind of go back to our base model. Now, in this case, I'm kind of using the base to sort of hide the geometry in the beginning, and it sort of gives me a place to bring models into my scene so they're not sort of flying off from all other parts of my camera. But basically, all I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of this and let's just kind of push it down inside the model. And then I'm going to have this occur over, let's say, 15 or 20 seconds. So I'm going to set my time slider to 600, start at 1. And then I'll keyframe all the geometry so that it's kind of living inside this ground plane box. Okay, so that'll be kind of its starting position. So I'm going to select the appliances, go to my channel box, select all this, key selected, and then I'm going to kind of run through each one of my pieces of geometry and key them in that starting location. And you don't need to see them. It's not that big of a deal. But I'll just kind of select each one using my outliner and key selected our translate, rotate, and scale values in our channel box. And there we go. So now everything's keyed underneath my ground plane at frame 1. And then what we'll do is we'll kind of sequence each piece coming into play sort of over the course of 600 frames. And we're going to sequence it so it's one and then the next. So let's say, let's start with the structure because that kind of grounds us a little bit. So I'm going to select the structure, and then I'm going to set my frame to frame 100. And I'm going to lift these objects up into place. And I'm going to kind of just sort of eyeball. You don't want them to be floating above your ground plane, obviously. So I'm just going to kind of drag them into place. So they're just touching that ground plane. Okay, and then I'll key those at that moment in time. So our first kind of animation in this sequence is those columns coming up into place. Okay. So that'll happen by frame 100. And then all the other geometry I want to stay or keep underneath here. And so what I'll do is, just to make sure that happens, I'm going to go through and key all the geometry in this position at frame 100. So I'm just going to run through kind of everything else and just key selected all of these so that they stay underneath through frame 100. Because if you don't do this and you start keying these objects moving through, you're going to notice that they kind of come in too soon. So I'm just going to key these. At frame 100. Okay. So then the next one I'm going to bring in, let's say it occurs by frame 150. So I'm going to set to frame 150, and let's bring in, let's say, the floor plates. So let's grab our floors, turn on our move tool. Now if your move tool is like way off over here for whatever reason, just do a modify center pivot, and that's going to center your gumball. I'm going to pull these floors up into view. And again, I'm just going to kind of eyeball their location. It's not super critical for something like this. And I'll key those at frame 150. And you know what? I'm actually going to bring the floor tiles with it. There's no real reason to have those animate separately. So I'm going to pull those up as well and modify center pivot and just kind of pull those up into space. And again, I'm just going to kind of eyeball their location. They sit just about flush with all that. And I'll key those as well. So now I've got the structure coming up first, and then the floor plates coming up next. And then we'll bring in the rest of the geometry. And so you just kind of have to like go through and sequence it so that everything arrives in stages. So let's do sort of the interior objects next. So I'm going to stay at frame 150. I'm going to grab the appliances, the cabinetry, the counter, fireplace, hardware, and we'll grab those, just that stuff. And I'll do a quick modify center pivot. And then I'm going to take and keyframe those at frame 150 so they stay underground at frame 150. And then I'm going to move myself to frame, let's say 200, or like, let's go 250. Be a little bit slower so you guys can see the difference in time. And then I'll pull all of this stuff up. And again, I'm just going to kind of eyeball it so it's just barely intersecting that geometry or the floor plate. And I'll key it there at frame 250. So now we've got something that looks like this. Start here, the play button. So we've got our columns growing, and then we've got our floor plates, and then we've got our interior cabinetry, appliances, and all that kind of stuff. So then let's go back to frame 250, and let's grab next, we can do, let's grab the stairs next, so we can pull those up. So again, I want to keep them under the ground up until frame 250, so I'll key them at that moment in time. Just do a quick modify center pivot. And then by frame 300, I'm going to have them raise up into view. We'll just kind of pull them all the way up to about there. That should look about right. That actually looks a little high, so kind of bring it down a little bit. Do something like that. Okay, and we'll key them there. And then we'll do the steel angles, which sort of connect to these wide flange columns. So frame 300, key them underground, and then by frame 350, center pivot, pull these up into space. If you zoom in, you can kind of see what these are. It's just sort of a welded angle that is intended to connect the window frames to the wide flange columns. And again, I'm just going to kind of eyeball these so they're pretty down close to the floor, just a little bit. Okay, and then we'll key those there. And then we can bring in our window frames, and I'm going to do the window frames and the window panes at the same time. So we'll we'll key those underground. So we'll just select all this, key selected, and then by frame, say like 450, these come up into play. And again, I'm going to align those with the tile on the ground. So just kind of pull them down some, get them pretty close. Okay. And then the last thing we'll bring in, or we'll key that. And then the last thing we'll bring in is the roof. Should be the last piece that's hidden under there. So we'll select the roof. Key selected underground at frame 450, so I know it's under there until that point in time. And then we'll go to frame 500. Move them up. So center that pivot and pull this up. And just sort of align it with the tops of those frames. You know, something like that. Okay. And we will key that object there. Okay. So once you go through and kind of sequence that event or those series of events, if we go back to frame 1, hit the play button, and we'll have this axon where first you have columns pop up, and you have your floor plates pop in, centerpiece or your center cabinetry, steel angles, glass, windows, and then the roof. Okay, I had that all happen over the course of 500 frames. So I'm just going to pause this real quick, set this down to 500 so my time slider isn't too long. Okay, and I'll set myself back to frame 1. Now that's just like one example of a sequenced movement of architectural elements. That might not be the best movement for your particular project. Again, you might have an exploded axon where things kind of separate and pull back together again. You might not be using a ground plane like I am here. You might just have things kind of oriented and floating in space and sort of pulling apart and coming back together again. That's all up to you. The point of this tutorial is to show you guys how to properly kind of keyframe a sequence of elements moving, and you just have to go like stage by stage through each element until it's doing exactly what you want it to do. Then you can, once you have the animation set, we can set our camera. So we'll go into our create camera, camera and aim. Click the options box so we can make sure we're grabbing an orthographic camera. Create that. Have our camera group. I'm going to pull the camera out to the side, pull it up, pull it over, get that axon view. Grab the aim, and I'm going to kind of center this on the object. And what you kind of want to do is set your frame to the end, because that's when all of our objects are in our scene, and that's what we want to kind of center our camera to. So I'll kind of pull that over to about there or so, and pull this up. Go out to my 4 viewports, panels. Down here, I'll switch one of my viewports to our camera 1. Again, we're like way too far zoomed in. So I'm going to select this camera, go into my attributes, scroll all the way down, go to my orthographic views, and set this to like 100. It's still a little zoomed in, so let's do like 120 or 130. It looks to be okay. And then we'll mess around with the aim a little bit. Kind of pull this up or down, just something like that. It's a little tricky. We'll turn on our viewport so we can see what's actually in our file. Pull that down a little bit. Alright, so we got our camera set, and your camera doesn't have to be still for this. It can zoom in, zoom out, pan around as things are kind of coming up into our scene. So we got our camera set. I'm just going to do a quick file save scene. And then we're going to add our ambient occlusion material. Assign new material. AI ambient occlusion. Okay. I'm going to turn on the geometry edges just so I can see. I'm going to do a quick rendered preview of what this looks like. Okay. So it's not too bad. One thing we can do is close out of this. Let's select that material. I'm going to make it somewhat higher quality. So I'm just going to select an object and go over to my attribute editor. And then using this arrow button here, I'm going to go all the way over to the final tab, which is our material. We applied that AI ambient occlusion. I'm going to up the samples to like 5 and then do a quick re-render. Looks a little bit cleaner. Okay, and then we'll exit out of that. Go into our render settings. I'm just going to set this to HD 1080. But again, use the first tutorial to make sure you guys set the proper rendering settings. You know, this wants to be camera 1. Your image format, again, that's PNG. And then frame animation extension. We don't want to do single frame because we're doing an animation. I usually just pick the last one down here, name underscore. And then click close. And then you can do sort of a final test render to see what the final image quality is going to look like. So it'll be quite a bit bigger. And again, this is like a really basic diagrammatic rendering. Obviously, there's no materials or lighting or anything like that involved. I'll do a follow-up tutorial on how to add textures, lights, all sorts of things like that, so you can get a little bit more of a realistic rendering out of it. Okay, so that looks pretty good. You can also test the rendering at a couple different moments in time. So like test it when it's just the columns in place. See how that looks. Okay, those look pretty good. Test it when just the cabinetry and floors are in. Render that out. And if objects, if you're not close enough to an object to see the detail required to understand what that object is, don't be afraid to kind of zoom your camera in, pan it around, and zoom it back out again as these things are coming up through the floor. And again, you can use the first tutorial to see how to keyframe your camera kind of moving around and zooming in and out. Okay. So yeah, that's how you keyframe an axon or an assembly of architectural parts.